Here's what Richard Dawkins says. The universe we observe has precisely the properties we should expect if there is at bottom no design, no purpose, no evil, no good, nothing but blind, pitiless indifference. I'm going to reference here a philosopher, Thomas Nagel. This is somewhat a ridiculous situation. It's just as irrational to be influenced in one's beliefs by the hope that God does not exist as by the hope that God does exist. C.S. Lewis called all these guys the nothing butters. Atheism equals naturalism and materialism. If there is no God, what else is there? What's left if there is no God? Hi, welcome to Church for Skeptics. Dan Arsenal here. The Bible talks about the man who dug a pit for himself and then fell into his own pit. That's a little bit what I want to talk about today. And I don't mean to be harsh. Please don't, I hope I'm not that. But I do need to be poignant, I guess is the word, and somewhat profound in what I want to say. I hope it doesn't come out as being harsh, but the title I'm going to call this is The Intellectual Bankruptcy of Atheism. And I think that's what we're going to talk about today is the argument from reason, which kind of, I think, is the epitome of a man falling into his own pit intellectually. Another way to say it might be throwing out the baby with the bathwater. If there is no God, what is there? What's left if there is no God? God's existence is a pretty big deal. Here's what Richard Dawkins says. The universe we observe has precisely the properties we should expect if there is at bottom no design, no purpose, no evil, no good, nothing but, C.S. Lewis called all these guys the nothing butters, nothing but blind, pitiless indifference. So think about this. If there is no God, there is no design, no designer, of course. That would be physically and morally. There's no design, there's no and so therefore there is no purpose on atheism. No good, no evil, nothing but blind. Now, when he says blind, what does that mean? It means there's no reason behind it. There's no purpose. There's no goal. There's no foresight. So nothing but blind, pitiless, which is sort of a amoral reference. Nothing but blind, pitiless indifference. Well, if atheism is true, that's probably true. Also, Richard Dawkins, I'll say this too, he said that Charles Darwin's greatest contribution, this is from Richard Dawkins, was to make atheism intellectually satisfying. So, of course, birds of a feather, they kind of go together. So what I'm saying is if there is no God, what's left? And that left, there's two sides of a coin. That's what's left. On the one hand, it is naturalism, which means that if there is no supernatural reality, then there obviously must be everything else has to be natural. So you have naturalism. Everything happens naturally. And the reason it does, the other side of that coin, is materialism. Nothing exists except matter. Physical things matter. So if there is no supernatural, everything's natural. If there is no immaterial reality, then everything is material. So you have naturalism and materialism. I'm going to reference here a philosopher, Thomas Nagel. He's 87 years old and is the professor emeritus of philosophy and law, which is pretty remarkable, really, at New York University, NYU. Here's an interesting little sideline note about him. He is from Belgrade, Serbia, and I've been to Belgrade. I love the city. I really enjoyed my stay there. Be cool to talk to him about that. I don't know how long he was there after he was born. It sounds like most of his career was here for a long time, of course, at NYU. But here's what he says, and he's gotten a lot of flack from the atheistic crowd, the materialistic crowd, the naturalistic crowd. But here's what he said. I speak from experience, being strongly subject to this fear myself. I want atheism to be true, and am made uneasy by the fact that some of the most intelligent and well-informed people I know are religious believers. It isn't just that I don't believe in God, and naturally I hope that I'm right in my head belief. We all think that. We all want to be right. It's that I hope there is no God, and that may be the bottom line for both of us. Atheists hope there's not. I hope there is. That's a big difference too. And then he says, I don't want there to be a God. I don't want the universe to be like that. So I guess that means at that point in time, he would like it to have been, as Richard Dawkins says, at bottom, no design, no purpose, no evil, no good, nothing but blind, pitiless indifference. But then he goes on to say this, my guess is, this is Thomas Nagel, my guess is that the cosmic authority problem is not a rare condition. Cosmic authority problem, I don't want there to be a God. And it is responsible for much of the scientism. Scientism is the idea that we can't learn anything except through science. We can certainly learn a lot from science. It depends what you think science is, and there's a lot of extra questions about that. But you understand what he's saying here. It's responsible. In other words, the cosmic authority problem, I don't want there to be a God, is responsible for much of the scientism. We have to do everything by science. And reductionism of our time. Now, reductionism means it's more nothing but. We're not really conscious. It's just an illusion. It's nothing but an illusion. We don't have free will. It's nothing but an illusion. That's what he's talking about. It's called reductionism. And so then he says, one of the tendencies it supports, that is scientism and reductionism, one of the tendencies it supports is the ludicrous overuse of evolutionary biology to explain everything about life. And now we're getting into where we're talking about here, which is the argument from reason against atheism. So again, here's the formula. Atheism equals, and there might be an exception to this, but I don't know of one. You can let me know in the comments. Atheism equals naturalism and materialism. If there is no God, what else is there? Everything's natural. We can explain everything by natural means. We call it natural law, but I'm hard-pressed to call it a law. That implies there's a lawgiver. It just means what always happens. Natural nature just always happens, bar miracles, of course. But that's another video for sure. And then he says, this is somewhat a ridiculous situation. It's just as, now watch this, what he's saying is, it's just as irrational on naturalism and materialism, it's just as irrational to be influenced in one's beliefs by the hope that God does not exist as by the hope that God does exist. All right, now, let me give you the argument for reason or from reason against naturalism and materialism. And here again, naturalists and materialists have dug their own pit and they're falling into it. In other words, they cannot explain rationally their own position. And let me explain why that is. Number one, this is a syllogism, of course. Number one, if everything is the result of blind, pitiless, mindless, natural processes, then no thought is valid. In other words, how did I come to my beliefs? Well, according to naturalism, nothing exists except blind, pitiless indifference. As Richard Dawkins would always say, I'm only dancing to my DNA. The reason I believe what I believe is because I'm wired that way. I can't help it. So that means I can't really change my mind unless the DNA programs me to do that somehow. I can't change Richard Dawkins' mind. He can't change my mind. We can't really have any kind of intellectual discourse there because we're all trapped in our DNA. We're trapped into thinking what we think because we think it. That's the problem here. But that's the first premise here, is that if everything is the result of blind, pitiless indifference, if it's the result of random mutations and natural selection, then it's not valid. And by valid, what I mean is it doesn't obey the laws of logic. It may obey the laws of physics and biology, but it doesn't obey the laws of logic. Here's another problem here. We say we talk about natural laws as having always happened. That's just what always happens. Gravity always works. The cosmological constant always works. It's what's always going on. Biologically, chemically, everything happens as it happens. But logic is not that way. It's not a physical law. And the reason we know that is because we do a lot of illogical things. Think about all the different ideas around the world today. People are arguing all the time about just about everything. And so obviously some of them are illogical and some of them are more logical. Some of them are half logical. The same thing's true about morality. Morality is not what always happens, like gravity. It's what usually doesn't happen. That's why we call things illogical and immoral. Number 2, if no thought is valid, and we say valid, again, that means that it conforms to the laws of logic, the law of identity, the law of non-contradiction, the law of the excluded middle. That's another video too. Number 2, if no thought is valid, then the thought naturalism is true is not valid. It can't be valid because it has not come about by the laws of logic and reason. Think about how the naturalists, this is the pit they've dug for themselves, the naturalists and the materialists, i.e. the atheists, think that everything that they believe has come as a product of reason. They have a rally for reason. They have enterprises that call it the reason, the development of reason in science, the Institute of Reason and Science. Sam Harris, the end of faith and the beginning of reason. But reason doesn't exist in a naturalistic, materialistic, atheistic universe. That's the problem, because everything is the result of natural processes, and natural processes are random and blind. In other words, there are no decisions being made in a naturalistic world. Think about it. Let me say it again. In a naturalistic, materialistic, atheistic world, there are no decisions being made. Charles Darwin said this. He said, "I have this horrid doubt that arises whether the convictions of a man's mind developed from lower animals are of any use or value at all." He didn't follow that much, I think, but he was on something there. Number 3, any thought that by its own conclusions invalidates itself ought to be rejected. If naturalism is true, that's the thought, naturalism is true, it's not valid because it doesn't come from reason. If it doesn't come from reason, it's not valid. If it's not valid, it ought to be rejected. But by its own definition, it cannot be validated by reason as well. You can say, well, by experience then. Doesn't work. Here's another Thomas Nagel quote here. "I have to be able to believe that I follow the rules of logic because they are correct, not merely because I am blindly, biologically programmed to do so." In other words, dancing by his DNA. "Insofar as the evolutionary hypothesis itself depends on reason, it would be self-undermining." In other words, self-contradicting. The worst kind of being incorrect or wrong is to be self-contradicting. One of the reasons that we can be self-contradicting is when we excuse ourselves from our own definitions. In other words, if I believe that naturalism and materialism is true, I have to exclude myself from that reality to make the case that naturalism and atheism and materialism is true. In other words, I am my own refutation for what I'm saying. That's a strong argument, I think. Thanks for watching. I hope it helps.